Here are some key lessons from Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin a few days ago. First of all, I was annoyed when I found out that Tucker Carlson was going to interview President Putin, because the war in Ukraine is the most important event in our time, and we need to have a serious conversation about it, and so far we haven't had one. And so it would be good to see a real journalist interview Putin, but not Tucker. Because Tucker is a TV host, he is an online influencer, he's an entertainer, but he's not a journalist. He has more in common with Jerry Springer and Alex Jones than he does with real journalism. And so it is an insult to the people who are harmed directly by the war to have a figure like Tucker center stage with a world leader. It's a mockery. But then when I watched the interview, I changed my mind, at least on this one point. And that's the first lesson. Lesson number one, the interview is appropriate for our time. This is peak Kali Yuga. Something about the interview really captures the degraded world we live in. It's an American idiocracy TV host interviewing an aging Russian president who is trying to lay out his worldview and his point of view while a bloody war is destabilizing the Western world order, Western security order in the background. And Tucker is a prime example of everything that's wrong with America, that's wrong with the West. He is loud and trivial and really a buffoon. He has the worldview of a child, and apparently this is the person that the Kremlin chose to invite for a conversation with the president. And so, in a way, this is all symbolically significant and appropriate, and it says a lot about the whole situation. And that brings us to lesson number two. Putin is lying about Russia's intentions. Of course Putin lied about some things. He said, for example, that Russia has absolutely no territorial claims in Poland or Latvia or any of the other countries in Eastern Europe that used to be in the Soviet sphere. And this is obviously not true. And he said exactly the same thing about Crimea and about Ukraine right before he invaded Ukraine. When he invaded and annexed Crimea, he said he had no interest in any further territories in Ukraine. Obviously, that's not true. And he's also using exactly the same ridiculous narrative about Nazis, about Russian-speaking people in the Baltics that he used about Ukraine to justify his invasion. So obviously his word on that issue cannot be trusted. And Putin also said that Ukraine started the war in 2014, although the invasion was from Russia into Ukraine, not the other way around, and that the big Russian invasion in 2022 was to stop the war. And so that's just incredible chutzpah, and of course, Tucker didn't question any of it, not a word. And that says a lot about the interview. But that is to be expected, of course. Putin is trying to manipulate the narrative to justify what he is doing in Ukraine at the moment. All right, lesson 3. The Soviet leaders themselves are responsible for the current borders with Ukraine. This one is obvious. Putin made a point of explaining, in a good way, that it was the Soviet leaders who decided to split the Soviet Union apart and make the republics independent, including Ukraine. And this is a point that I have explained many times, including in my millennial interview, that you can't compare the split up of the Soviet Union with some other countries that have been cut up by enemy forces because they have been conquered and defeated in war. And some commentators have tried to do that, saying that in similar ways that other countries have been split up, divided by occupying forces or by forces that have defeated them in war, cut up a country, and that those countries try to unite again after they've been split up. Well, the situation with the split up of the Soviet Union is very different because it's the Russians and the Ukrainians who made the decision themselves 30 years ago to split up the Soviet Union and make the republics independent. It's their decision, so they should stand by it, and they shouldn't start massacring people to revise those borders now while screaming about Anglo-Saxons and Nazis and trying to blame everyone else for their problems. Lesson 4. We're just as bourgeois as you. Putin wanted to join NATO. Putin said that he wanted Russia to join NATO, and he said that before. In other words, he mostly shares NATO's values. And this, again, should be a lesson for American conservatives. We are just as bourgeois as you, Putin said. So Russia wanted to get closer to NATO, that is the US, in that respect. They wanted a closer relationship with the US. So Putin stretched out his hand and the US slapped it down because Russia is too big of a country for the US to control, so the US kept Russia at arm's length. And I have no doubt that this is true. I have no doubt that it's mostly American attitudes toward Russia that have made the relationship between the two countries frosty now. And Russia went all in on the bourgeois capitalism, wanted to be a part of the quote-unquote civilized West, as Putin put it, but the US pushed Russia away. Putin said at one point, "I'm not bitter because we are not husband and wife. I just found out that we are not welcome there." But I think this is an appropriate statement, or rather that the comparison is appropriate. I think there's more in the husband and wife metaphor than Putin would like to admit. The US and Russia seem to have an obsessive and bitter relationship to each other since the Cold War, and they never make sober, clear-headed comments about each other. Very much like, in fact, a bitter ex-husband and wife. So, in other words, there is not so much an ideological split between the US and Russia. It's just rivalry about power between two states that have more in common than either of them would like to admit. And so the question is, how do Putin's Western fanboys square that equation? Because they talk about NATO as if it is the root of all evil, and Putin is a hero for fighting against NATO, but Putin and Russia wanted to join NATO. And the only reason they didn't join NATO is because NATO rejected them, according to Putin himself. And that's why they're fighting against each other now. And so that brings us to the fifth lesson. Lesson number 5. Putin's Western fanboys are worshipping an imaginary friend. The most revealing part of the interview was the vibe, the dynamic between Tucker and Putin. Tucker was approaching the interview as an apprentice, as a fanboy, but the admiration was not mutual. And this is important because it brings attention to the bigger problem of a fake reality created by the media, both by the old media and the new social media online. A large part of our political discourse revolves around imaginary events, false ideas about people and countries. I'll just give you one example. In 2015, 2016, the so-called alt-right painted a picture of Donald Trump as their champion, as the quote-unquote God Emperor, who would be the great champion of their cause. And when the so-called God Emperor got into the White House, he didn't follow the script that the alt-right had dreamed up for him. That script was just a result of their own wishful thinking that they projected onto Trump. It was what they hoped that Trump would be, without any real evidence. And so they were completely disillusioned by the fact that this God Emperor Trump that they had dreamed up wasn't real. The real Trump was very different, and his fans didn't know how to deal with that. And now, those same, mostly American, right-wingers and conservatives and QAnon people and Tucker Carlson fans and Alex Jones fans and the leftovers from the so-called alt-right have dreamed up an imaginary avatar, an imaginary profile of Vladimir Putin and today's Russia. And in this imaginary world, Putin is the champion of values that American conservatives share. And these American conservatives have dreamed up that they and Putin share a common cause. This fantasy image has gone so far that the American right has spent the last 2 years acting as a megaphone for every sentence and every word and every syllable of Russian war propaganda. So they created their own mythology about Russia and Putin based on wishful thinking, just like they did in 2015, 2016 with Donald Trump. And it was clear that Tucker approached this interview from the point of view of this American conservative narrative. And Putin was wondering what the hell Tucker was talking about. Because apparently Putin didn't get the memo that he was supposed to be this cartoon figure from the American conservative mind. And Tucker tried to convey this vibe of we understand each other, we are on the same wavelength, but it all fell flat, and Putin clearly thought that Tucker was a fool. And so this is a beautiful example of the metaverse colliding with reality. It's like a guy who has an imaginary romantic relationship with a famous girl. He's built a whole imaginary life together with this celebrity. He's built a shrine to her in his bedroom. And then when he gets a chance to meet her in real life, she says, "Who the hell are you?" And those were the vibes that I got from the interview. With regard to Russia and Putin, American conservatives live entirely in a fictional universe. They have bought into this ridiculous fantasy that Putin is the champion of wholesome conservative values because they once saw a picture of him riding on a bear and they thought that looked masculine and cool, and that's about as deep as their analysis goes. And that brings us to lesson number 6. Tucker didn't ask a single tough question. And many observers have pointed out this, that Tucker didn't ask any difficult questions, and that's true. And in a way, it's obvious that Tucker wouldn't ask a single tough question because he has attached his own credibility to Russia and Putin. Tucker has propagandized on behalf of Russia, trying to justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine ever since it started. That pro-Russian propaganda is now central to his brand and what he represents. So in a sense, this interview was Tucker's chance to redeem himself by redeeming Putin. He had a personal interest in making Putin look good. So he didn't ask anything about the Wagner mutiny, or what happened to Prigozhin, or the Ukrainian drone strikes in Moscow, or the upcoming election in Russia, or what has happened to the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea, where a good chunk of it has been taken out by Ukraine. He didn't ask anything about any issue that could show any weakness on the Russian side. Nothing that could be embarrassing for Putin. And that brings us to the final lesson, lesson 7. Putin did not play along with Tucker's narrative. Now, Putin was not a good, obedient PR subject. And this is probably the most important takeaway from the interview. Tucker was clearly frustrated that he didn't get the narrative he wanted from Putin. Tucker was disappointed that he didn't get the fast food talking points that he wanted to feed his audience. Tucker wanted answers that fit into his cartoonish talk show worldview, but he didn't get them, no matter how he tried to put words into Putin's mouth. Tucker tried so hard to frame the narrative that he even answered his own questions several times, but even that didn't work. It failed. Tucker asks, "Do you really think that Zelensky runs the country?" Putin answers, "Yes, of course." Well, that wasn't the answer that Tucker was looking for, because Tucker is pushing his own version of QAnon and Alex Jones and so on, where everything is a conspiracy. So he asks Putin the same question again, a couple of times, trying to get the answer he wanted, but Putin just continues saying, yes, of course Zelensky runs the country. Big fail for Tucker. And throughout the entire interview, the vibe from Tucker is, this is the right narrative, right? This is what happened, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like an eager puppy dog. And Putin just looks at him wondering what the hell he's talking about. It was actually remarkable. And Putin, for example, Putin said it doesn't matter if the US president is Biden or Trump, because the elite calls the shots anyway. And Tucker thought, oh, here we go. Now I'll get a chance for a juicy conspiracy theory for the X-Files worldview that I'm peddling to my audience. And so he asked Putin, who are the elites? Rubbing his hands, essentially. And Putin just answered something about the complicated election system in the US. And so he completely deflated the hype that Tucker was hoping for. And Tucker also tried pushing Christian talking points to show what a wholesome guy Putin is, to sell Putin to his conservative Christian American audience. But also there, Putin refused to play along and stay on the message that Tucker wanted. Putin said, no, I don't see God's hand at work in the world events. I just see the rise and fall of nations. He gave a sort of historical and cyclical theory. And Tucker wanted so bad to be Putin's PR man for your typical Christian American conservative audience, for basically the Fox News audience or his audience. Tucker wanted Putin to be relatable to that kind of audience. But Putin was not a good, obedient PR subject, because Putin is nothing like the American Christian conservatives. Putin is an old, loyal Soviet system man who became liberal progressive when the Soviet Union ended. He is the leader of an enormous empire with Christians and Muslims and Jews, and he is a pragmatist, so he is trying to accommodate all of their wishes to some extent. And also, Tucker said several times, basically begging Putin to say that NATO was aggressive. Essentially, it was NATO that forced you to attack, right? It was NATO, you feared for a NATO invasion of Russia, right? Essentially, please say that you fear that the US will attack Russia and create a regime change, and that's why you had to invade Ukraine. Tucker tried really hard to frame the question so he'd get the answer he needed, and Putin laughed it off. And instead, he went on this long talk about why Ukraine is actually Russian territory, and he made it clear that he does not fear an attack on Russia. And that should be obvious. Of course, no one will attack Russia. Tucker continued to frame and reframe questions and put words in Putin's mouth because it seemed like he didn't think that Putin went hard enough on his own war propaganda. Tucker came across as more of a true believer in this war than even Putin himself. It's like Tucker thought it was a bigger deal, more important thing than Putin himself. And sometimes I get the impression from American conservatives that they have, or right-wingers, that they have propagandized this war even harder than Russia itself has done. It's like American right-wingers have psyched themselves up so much about this war narrative that when they actually meet a real Russian, it becomes an anticlimax, because Russians are real people. They're not the cartoon figures that Tucker and his fans, his crowd of conspiracy theorists, are hoping for. And so Tucker really tried to prod Putin in the direction of the narrative that Tucker likes. He tried to get Putin to say the slogans or talking points that Tucker likes. Tucker kept saying things that the American right-wing, conservative, QAnon crowd thinks is the right narrative about this war, but Putin did not follow his lead. And so Tucker was like an apprentice going to the master, showing the master the work that he had done, thinking that he'll get a pat on the head, but instead the master didn't even acknowledge the narrative that the apprentice had been diligently pushing on his behalf over the last 2 years. And this illustrates a bigger problem in American popular culture. Americans believe that the rest of the world is like a theme park, like an amusement park. Of course, not all Americans. I'm talking about American popular culture, but this really bleeds into political discourse as well. It's like they say, let's go over to the Russia roller coaster where everything is quote unquote based. It's like you go on one of those scary rides where all the stereotypical figures pop up, like it's not a real country. But Russia is a real country. It's not a roller coaster. It's not a theme park. And Putin is a real person. He's not a Mickey Mouse figure in an amusement park. And so Tucker expected Putin to be this caricature that American culture has invented, which the American liberal establishment hates and the American conservatives love as their champion. But that is entirely a fantasy image that America is projecting onto Russia and Putin. So it's the nightmare of the left liberal establishment and the erotic dream of the American conservatives. And so in conclusion, we can say that this interview was a small win for Putin, but a big L for Putin's Western fans. We can say that the interview was a small victory for Putin. He got a chance to share his point of view for almost 2 hours, uninterrupted, to a worldwide audience, hundreds of millions of viewers, and Putin did pretty well. I don't agree with the Western media saying that he seemed unhinged. His ideology is the opposite of mine. I completely disagree with him, but he came across as a balanced figure, even likable in some respects. Putin is a normal Russian president. It's funny, at one point he said that he liked George Bush. And that was one of the funniest moments in the interview, because that's sort of who Putin is. He thought that, well, Bush is an example of a good president that I can respect. That says something about who Putin is and the misconceptions that others might have of him. So in general, Putin was relaxed, he was at ease, he was laughing, he was sharing anecdotes, he was like a fun uncle with stories to tell. And that's something that Western liberals don't understand because they have a child's view of the world. The problem with Putin isn't that he's an unpleasant person. The problem is that he is the leader of a country that is right now attacking Europe and the West. And that makes him an enemy in geopolitical terms, but it doesn't necessarily make him unhinged or crazy. Again, this is the American Hollywood worldview shining through. But most of all, the interview was a big failure for Tucker and the rest of Putin's Western fanboys. I can't see it any other way, because in a way, it doesn't matter that it was a PR stunt and that Tucker didn't ask any tough questions. It doesn't matter that the interview didn't bring attention to problems in Putin's regime and the war in Ukraine, because the interview was directed mostly at a Western, slightly right-wing audience, and it brought attention to the intellectual bankruptcy of Putin's Western fanboys. They are cheerleaders for a completely fake, imaginary figure that they have dreamed up. A fantasy figure who has absolutely nothing to do with the real man. So the interview can be described as a small win for Putin, but a big fail for Putin's fans in the West. Tucker went to Disneyland and he wanted to see Mickey Mouse, but Putin didn't agree to put on the Mickey Mouse costume. He refused to live up to the dream image that the Americans have projected onto him. And so when I or someone else tries to tell these Western, quote-unquote, right-wingers or conservatives that they are completely deluded about Putin, of course, they don't listen. But maybe, just maybe, they'll listen when they hear it from Putin himself. We can always hope. Who knows? So the best that can come out of this interview is that it brings an end to the American fantasy image that they have projected onto Russia and Putin, so that maybe we can finally start to have a real conversation about the most serious event in our time, which is Russia's war against Ukraine and what it means for the rest of our part of the world, of the West. It's at least conceivable that the interview will have that effect, since it's aimed at an American conservative audience and they are the ones who need to hear it the most. And that's all I had to say on the topic. I hope you found it helpful. I'll talk to you again next time.